God expects me to fulfill his commands, and if I do not do that, I will be sent to hell. This is from an article written by Javier Martin, which interviews a 17-year-old teenager who was raised in an evangelical Christian family. Being in a cult negatively impacts the psychological development, the formation of identity, and specific characteristics of children and young adults. From the ages of 14 to 19, I was in a cult. It wasn't until after I left that I realized just how abusive the organization was. After leaving, I suffered a multitude of mental illnesses that came along with going against everything that I had been taught and that was instilled in me for years. Today I'm going to be covering 3 main questions that answer how cults negatively impact the lives of children and young adults. The first question is, who do the children and young adults learn from in these cults? The second question I'm going to be covering today is, what and how are the children being taught in these cults? The third question is, how have the learned behaviors, mindsets, actions, and beliefs of the cult leaders negatively impacted the lives of these children and young adults? Getting into the first question, which is, who do children in cults learn from? As children grow, they sponge in information provided from their sources and their environments. Eventually, they form their own identity, their own beliefs, and their own mindsets based upon what they gather from their environments and what they decide to take in. In a cult environment, it's a little bit different than if a child grew up in a regular environment. Typically, the sources children are provided with are their parents, their guardians, teachers, other classmates, babysitters, etc. But in a cult environment, the cult leader is actually considered all power and authority over the parents, the children, and all members of the cult. The cult leader is considered godly in a sense, considered very charismatic, and somebody that is an ideal being, somebody to look up to. And therefore the children growing up in cult environments are learning from the cult leaders and those in power within the organizations. Moving on to the second point is, what and how are the children learning in these cults? The most important thing in a cult is to be in line with the faith of what's being taught. If there's any question or doubt or anything that would be considered rebellious against the faith, against the cult, it is up to the leader to reprimand whatever member, children, adult, teenager, it doesn't matter, to reprimand them very strictly and harshly. Along with this, being reprimanded very harshly is verbal abuse. That's the main key component used to inform the individual of their lack of power, to make sure that they continue to obey what is being taught in these cults, and to make sure that they continue to stay isolated, that they don't go outside of the cult or question any of the beliefs of the cult, because that could cause them to falter in their faith. The third question is, how have the learned behaviors, the mindsets, the actions, everything that these children and young adults are soaking up from their surroundings and their environments, how is that affecting them? Well, dealing with continual verbal abuse and being taught to stay so isolated and stay within these certain boundaries doesn't prepare you for a world in which you're going to need to cope with expectations that are higher above your own. It's way above what you're used to. And Andrea Matthews observes that people in cults lack the necessary coping skills needed for a world with completely different expectations than what they're used to. They're not prepared to deal with anything outside of what the cult has taught them, and that causes for a lot of problems within social affiliations, along with their own personal mental struggles that they're dealing with from, the verbal abuse they're facing and having to cope by taking on the ideals and beliefs of their leaders and those around them. If the members of the cult decide to go against what they're taught and go against what they are made to believe, then they suffer from extreme guilt and shame, and they feel a sense of betrayal. It's very instilled that it's not just a one-person deal in the whole organization. Like, if one person falters, it's very much a problem of everybody. And you feel like you let more than one person down if you go against what you're taught to believe. To deal with coping of the high expectations of the cult, Lorna Goldberg states that the children and young adults take on the teachings of the leader to cope with the high expectations of their environments. In order for them to survive, and in order for them to, survive is a good way to put it actually, in order for them to survive their upbringing, they have to push down their own identities and take on what's being taught, and if they don't, they suffer major consequences. That's something that later on brings on a lot of mental illnesses such as depression, anxiety, a harsh inner critic, people-pleasing, all of these things that become a part of an aspect of their personality, which is caused by having to deal with the wild expectations of being in a cult. To summarize everything up, being in a cult, being raised in a cult, being in a cult during your early developmental stages of life causes a lot of negative impacts on the life of a young person or of a child. A lot of the times it ends in having to deal with leftover mental illnesses, a lot of spiritual abuse, trauma, etc., etc. And without the cult mentality, these are things that these people may or may not ever had to have dealt with. Thank you.